So before I start, I want all of you, in the back of your mind, so don't answer this, to think, what is truth? What is truth? Just have that in the back of your mind. So in order to answer the question of how we can know God exists, I think there's three main arguments. Number one, the idea of God, which is theoretical. Number two is what I've noted down as the personal God, otherwise known as personal experience from myself or others. And the most important one, in my opinion, comes down to the historical evidence that we have for Jesus Christ. So I'll take those about in turn, and they're so useful and relevant. So firstly, the idea of God. As you see, I've split that into three separate ideas. So first of all, the design argument. You'll have all heard it before in some way, shape or form, whether it be in RE class or just in general. The design argument goes like this. Whether you look at the vastness of the universe or how intricate the human body is, you can see that things are created perfectly, and that therefore it is very unlikely, in fact irrational, to say that it was just created by chance. And because of that, there's a need for a creator, and that creator is found in God. Now scientists will say that they maybe just don't know the answer yet to where the universe came from, but the universe had a beginning. That is established in science through the likes of people called Galileo and others, that there was a beginning, and therefore in the beginning there was either an atom which blew up, and that's what's known as the Big Bang Theory, which you'll have heard of, or there was God. And people say, where did God come from? But I ask, where did the atom come from? And if I was to hedge my bets on whether there was an atom at the beginning or a God who is eternal, then I would hedge my bets on God. Because God doesn't need to be created, and if he were created, he wouldn't be God. So that's the design argument. Then the moral argument. Now that's the one that is a bit more convoluted, so I'll spend more time to try and help you guys to understand what I'm trying to say. So I've just written down on the page, right and wrong exist, therefore God exists. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to pick on someone here, so I will pick on Natalie. Okay, Natalie, if I were to murder Connor Devaney right now, would it be wrong?
Yes, 100%.
Yes, good. Glad you didn't think this was a trick question. Of course it would be wrong, and if you thought otherwise, get counselling, please. But now I want to ask you a harder question. If I were to murder Connor right now, why is it wrong? I'm asking Natalie for this.
Because murder is like against the Bible and Christianity, and it's like a commandment.
Okay, but you're obvious. For those who aren't Christians, most non-Christians would also say murder is wrong. So for them, how can they justify murder being wrong without mentioning the Bible?
Because you're taking someone else's life for no reason.
And why is that wrong? Don't worry, I'm trying to prove a point here, so.
Because it's just wrong, and you shouldn't do that.
There we go.
You'll end up in trouble in prison.
You've hit the nail on the head when you said the statement, it's just wrong. Because we as humans know deep down that there is right and there is wrong. And on your page there, you'll have seen that I've written down two words. And I want to explain what they mean, because they're so important, not just for apologetics, but just in general life. You'll hear them a lot. And they're subjective and objective. They sound confusing, but they're actually really not. When I give you an example here. Subjective, all it means is personal opinion. So a subjective idea is something like Andrew is great. Okay? It's opinion. Yes, I was going to say he may make a joke about this. Objective is something that is true regardless of opinion. So Andrew has said that him being great is true regardless of opinion. Obviously that's not true. Sorry, Andrew. An objective fact is we are in a church. That is true even if you don't think we're in a church, because we just are. And if you don't think we're in a church, then I don't know what you're thinking. So that's the difference. And the reason I'm pointing that out is that if we are to try and understand right and wrong, we cannot do it on our own logic. The only way we can justify something being right or wrong is from something outside of ourselves, and that is found in God. He is the reference point. To put it bluntly, because obviously that's quite a big idea, C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia Chronicles, put it like this: for a man to know a line is crooked, he must know a straight line. And what that's pointing at is that if we're to know something is right or wrong, we need a reference point. We need a foundation on which to base that. Now, disclaimer here, often people, when they make this argument, the criticism would be, well, there's Christians who aren't good people. Does that mean that God is bad? But the argument is not saying that only Christians can be moral people. There are people who are not Christians who are morally probably better than some Christians. However, the argument is saying that God writes right and wrong on everyone's hearts, regardless of whether they're a Christian or not. So that's the moral argument, that right and wrong exist. It has to come from somewhere. It comes from God. And it's written on everyone's hearts, whether they're a Christian or not. So, design argument, moral argument. And the third one, the philosophical one, is so important, especially in this modern age where mental health crisis is occurring. The philosophical argument basically says that without God, there is no ultimate purpose. Now, people will respond to that and say we can make our own purpose. And to an extent, that's right, you can. You can set yourself goals, but those goals are not ultimate. Those goals can fail, and those goals are not based on anything beyond yourself. Whereas Christianity says that we are created by God out of love, and we have a purpose. And if everything is solely made by science, everything is therefore random, and everything therefore does not have a purpose. So in order to get purpose, it needs to come from outside ourselves. Design argument, moral argument, philosophical. And that points to the idea of God. But you can't rely on that solely, because you might be thinking, okay, God might exist, but why the Christian God? Why not the Muslim God? Why not the Hindu God? Or many of the other gods people talk about? And that's what these next two arguments try and show. So the next thing I put down is the personal God. And what that says is the personal experience is really good at showing that God exists, and whether it be your own experience or others. So I could literally stand up here for an hour, maybe around that, talking about the experiences God's given me, but I'll share one or two just to show that God isn't just an idea, but that he's personal and that he's living within Christians today. So I might have told you this, but I'll tell it again because it's still really cool. When I went to Summer Madness, there was one night where they were playing music, and I was listening to it, looking around, and I just felt this real emotion. I felt this joy seeing everyone worship. And then this guy comes up to me, who I'd never met in my life, and I'm not just saying that, I mean that. And he comes up to me and he goes, God wants me to speak to you. And I thought, this is weird, this has never happened to me before. And then the guy goes, God will fight your battles for you, and God has your life planned out for you. He'll fight your battles and he has that life planned out for you. That guy had no reason to lie to me. He wasn't someone who knew me trying to comfort me. He was some random who came up to me to say this, because I believe God spoke to me through that man at a tough time in my life. And there's many other stories I know of people who have seen people be healed miraculously. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some people who claim to be healed, which is just false. Faith healers in America looking for money. I don't believe in that, don't worry. But if you ask any Christian, whether it be us as leaders, whether it be someone you know from school or whatever, everyone has a story to tell, whether it's a big story or whether it's just a case of God making their life better. And so that's really important to point to. And lastly, is probably the most important argument of how we can know God exists, is because Christianity can be proved 100% and it can be disproved. And that is through the historical evidence of Jesus. And in order for this to work, Jesus has to have lived, he has to have died on the cross, and then risen again. Because if Jesus did not rise again from the dead, then Christianity is false, and it is no more than any other religion or worldview. So I'm going to take those individually. For someone to try and say Jesus did not exist, they're quite frankly an idiot. And I don't use that word lightly or being mean to them, but it is consensus amongst even atheists. That means everyone agrees that Jesus existed as a person. You'll see I put a quote there from an atheist guy called Jared Luderman, who said, we can be certain that Jesus existed. So he did exist. And this is recorded through the Bible, which itself, often people criticize it because they think it was written by some madman. But it itself is a historical document. So it is. And anyone who's done any sort of history will know how reliability works. The more sources you have of something, the more reliable it is. Because therefore you have more sources to compare with one another, and more sources to iron out any discrepancies, stuff like that. So the more you have, the more reliable, okay? Take figures like Julius Caesar, or philosophers like Aristotle or Plato. You might not have heard of them, but they're still big people. Regardless, they have, on the whole, around less than 100 sources between them. Aristotle, I've written there, has 5 sources written about him from the time he existed. The New Testament, on the other hand, you'll see there, and I didn't just pluck this figure out of thin air, I pulled it out of truth, is 6,428 sources. 6,428. And that's crazy. People doubt Jesus existed, but they don't doubt Aristotle existed. But you see the figures there, that there's far more sources about Jesus. And that's incredible. And it just doesn't get talked about because people don't want to face the reality that it might be true. Also, there's sources outside the Bible which are very useful. There's a guy I've written down there called Josephus. He was a Jew, and the Jews hated Christians. I can't emphasize that enough. Jews despised the Christians, and therefore this guy Josephus had no reason to lie about Jesus. In fact, he'd want to try and disprove him, but instead he verifies him. And so therefore we can take his word to be true, because it's not biased. It's a very important word in history, if you haven't learned about it yet. So Jesus did live. The next question then is, did he die on the cross to have risen? Because if someone has to rise from the dead, they have to die. And so Jesus was crucified. It's written in Roman history. It was the classic thing to do back in the day. But some atheists would say that the reason Jesus supposedly rose from the dead was that he didn't actually die on the cross. Instead, he was just injured, which would make sense, because if he was just injured, of course he could be seen after his death, because he never died in the first place. But that argument is false and flawed. You'll see there, the American Medical Association, they're scientists, they're not religious. They, in fact, openly, most of the time, hate God. And they did studies into the supposed death of Christ, and they concluded that the wounds written about, which were namely that blood and water came out of him whenever he was stabbed, are in line with death by asphyxiation. Asphyxiation is what happened on the cross, because you can't breathe, and that's why he died on the cross, and it was gruesome. You hung up there for hours on end without being able to breathe until eventually your lungs couldn't take it no more, and you died. And that's what happened to Jesus for us. So Jesus lived and he died. And most importantly, he was seen again after he died. And if he was seen again and he rose from the dead, then he was who he says he was, and he was the Son of God. And so to prove that he was seen again, this is crucial, and so often it gets said but not really emphasized. The first people who saw Jesus, supposedly, after he died, were women. And saying that now doesn't sound like much. Of course it doesn't. It shouldn't. But back then, women were second-class citizens. They couldn't vote, they couldn't testify in court, they were just considered not reliable whatsoever. It's like if I were to try and justify something by saying a loony or someone from a mental asylum saw it first. You wouldn't do it because it would make you not credible. But the writers of the Bible used women because that's what actually happened. Women saw Jesus. If people were making up the story that Jesus rose from the dead, they would have chosen someone reliable like a religious leader, an old white man, something like that. That people would have believed back then, but they didn't, because this is true. Women saw Jesus. But more importantly, 500 people saw Jesus after he supposedly died, at the same time. 500 people at the same time. Now people would then say to that they were just hallucinating, making it up in their heads. But as you can see there, there's an agnostic. Agnostic just means someone who's not sure whether they believe in God or not, called Roberta Waters. She's a psychologist. She said that for 500 people, to hallucinate the same thing would be more of a miracle than Jesus rising from the dead. Because hallucinations are individual events. What I mean by that is that if I were to hallucinate that there was a man dressed up as a pig about to kill me, really random, I know, James wouldn't be hallucinating that. He might be hallucinating something completely different. It's an individual thing, not a group thing. And so therefore those 500 people did see Jesus. So Jesus lived, he died, and he was seen again after he died. And which leads to the immense conclusion that Jesus was who he said he was. He was the Son of God. And because he was the Son of God, God exists. That's the historical argument. And C.S. Lewis puts a really important quote near the bottom there. He says, Christianity is either of the utmost importance, of no importance, but it can't be of moderate importance. And what that means is it's either the most important or it doesn't matter. There's no in between. And if this stuff is true, which I really do think it is, and if you look at the facts, which aren't biased, I hope you can come to the conclusion yourself that this stuff is true and so important and life-changing. And I'd really recommend it. I said to look into the story of Lee Strobel, a guy really close to my heart, who looked into this sort of stuff and became a Christian from it. He was a hardcore atheist, became a Christian after looking into this stuff. The disciples' lives were changed. Our lives in this room as leaders have been changed by this stuff. And C.S. Lewis, at the bottom there, such an amazing quote, I love it. He says Jesus was either a liar, a madman, or he was who he says he was. And so whenever you go home tonight, I want you to ask yourself, what do you think? Because so often we're caught up in the busyness of the world that we don't actually think about the life's big questions. We don't think where we came from, and we don't think where we go when we die, because we're too scared to, most of the time. And this is for Christians as well. We as Christians can be too busy, but we need to think of these questions. They are so much more important than anything you could ever ask, because they will affect everything you do for the better.